guys, it's Jessie, and today I will be filming my video for the queer book review, and this month I read Naked Lunch, and if you read along with me, you also read this book. So, I finished this book really early in the month. I was not expecting to do that. I got a head start on reading Naked Lunch because I was pretty sure that it was going to take me forever to read. Because I was worried that it was going to be, like, way above, like, my usual level of reading, because generally I haven't had the time to do any reading, but turns out it was surprisingly easy to finish. I mostly would just read in the evening before I would go to sleep. So I am filming this on October 14th, and I promise I will not be starting our next book until, like, probably October 28th. So that way I don't finish it super early again. I've sort of separated out all of the books that we read each month into categories. And so the category for this month was a book written by a queer person that isn't necessarily about queer characters. But the structure of this book is different. And it's written by William S. Burroughs, who I'm going to be calling Bill Burroughs because that is how Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac refer to him. And I'm very used to that because that's mostly what I've read from the Beat Generation. I chose this because, one, I love the Beat Generation, and two, I didn't want to force everyone to read a lot of Hannah Moskowitz this year, because while she is my favorite, that would be overkill for everyone else. So, I chose this. So, Naked Lunch was written during a period of time where authors were really invested in writing about the subconscious, and, like, achieving a higher level of, like, universal consciousness. And so this book and several other pieces of literature, including Howl, including On the Road, were very influential in starting up the hippie movement. They had a big impact on musicians like the Grateful Dead and Bob Dylan. I went into this knowing that it was going to be not a linear story because when Bill Burroughs wrote this, he was very, very high. It's basically autobiographical, memoir style, kind of the same way that Jack Kerouac writes his books. And the reason for that is because he was sort of writing to display his conscience so that other people and other writers could see what is possible. And he also, utilizes a lot of his own sort of experiences as a drug addict. Bill Burroughs is sort of known for being the person that experimented the most with drugs in the core Beat Generation. In this book, he talks a lot about heroin, some amount about marijuana, not really that much about cocaine, and not that much about benzodrine, which is a little surprising because if you know anything about the writing of On the Road, Jack Kerouac wrote down all of his experiences when he got home and he was high on benzodrine, and he just wrote, like, very, very fast to just get it all out. So that's, like, how the original scroll of that was written. This is my favorite sort of period of literature, so I've done a lot of research. So this book follows this structure. So it starts off with the main character, Lee, going to score some heroin. And then he gets high, and the rest sort of enters into this alternate, like, world, not like world, but it enters into his subconscious, and it talks about sort of when you're in the subconscious, which is Lee's subconscious, so it's really Bill Burroughs's, it goes into this world called the Inner Zone, where everyone lives in this one apartment complex that is also sort of like a mental institution with a lot of really messed up doctors. It's hard to explain without reading it, but it becomes clear as you're reading that, like, some of the story is there. Some of the story is in New York, and then some of the story is in Tangier. So sometimes you're in the Inner Zone talking about psychological experiments, sometimes they're talking about torture, and like gay sex sometimes, and then sometimes you're in Tangier where everything is gay sex, drugs, and violence, which is very interesting. What I really got out of this novel was that Bill Burroughs' subconscious was preoccupied with violence and sex for the most part, and that so when talking about this book, there's not really a structure. I will say that I did give it 4 out of 5 stars. So what I liked about this was the experimentation with the subconscious. I really like the lyrical style. I think it's really interesting. I think it's very, like, typical Beat Generation. I think, like, Burroughs is the cut and the dry of it. Jack Kerouac is the flowery, embellished Beat Generation lyrics, and then Allen Ginsberg is the hard, punchy style. But you can hear it in the way that they write. It's very, like, their use of language is very stuck in the world that they were living in. They didn't want to, start using language that they weren't using. They wanted to make sure that they were using words like hip and dig and, saying H instead of heroin, things like that. It's, when you've read enough beat literature like I have, you see the consistent style. It's hard to sort of explain unless you also have, like, a frame of reference, because, like, I'm just so bogged down in this frame of reference at this point, and I've never, like, spoken, like, pedagogically about the beatniks, so I really didn't dislike this book, but I did really feel very uncomfortable with the amount of violence, and the descriptions of sex were extremely graphic, to the point where it was unappetizing, and that might just be my experience, because sometimes, watching, sex scenes in movies or whatever is really, like, uncomfortable, and, like, for me, personally, in my experience, makes me feel like I want nothing to do with this. I am better than these human desires, and I never want to be involved in them ever, but that's, like, not how I actually feel, because like, sex is normal and natural, and it's, it's good, and it brings you closer to God, but in this context, it almost seems like the sex was hateful, and not even self-serving, like, just animalistic, but I think that's part of the subconsciousness. Like, I don't know what it was like to be Bill Burroughs. I don't know what his personal experiences with sex were. It's interesting. I can't necessarily say it was a bad thing. I just said that I don't like it because it did make me feel uncomfortable, but, I mean, I kept reading, so... I also really hated this one character, Dr. Benway, who lives in the inner zone, and he's, like, a sinister, like, doctor, scientist, psychiatrist person. I really hated him. I really just did. So but, I mean, I feel like there's nothing I can say other than, like, I just didn't like that character because I thought he was awful and scary. Why would you like the person who's characterized the most as the villain? One of the interesting things is that Bill Burroughs only refers to gay people as queers or the F slur. And I think that's really interesting because there were no positive words to refer to gay people at this time. And so here, the use of queer is a slur. But it's like a self-identified slur, which is really fascinating to think about. I chose this book because I knew it was written by a queer person. I don't want this book to be an example of queer culture to anyone. I don't want young people reading this to be like, that's what it is to be gay, like, now I have to become a heroin addict. No, you don't. It's just a book written by someone who died in the 90s which is very surprising because he was very addicted to drugs for a very long time, which tends to lower your lifespan, but he lived a long time, much longer than Jack Kerouac, who died of alcoholism. Just saying. It's a good book. I had a good time reading it, but I feel like it's hard to recommend to other people because not that many people have, the same amount of knowledge that I have about this book and the time period that it was written in and the social scene that it was written in, why it was written. Yeah, people might enjoy it. I don't know if I would have enjoyed it if I had gone into it with less knowledge. I like reading this sort of, it's not about queer people, but it's written by a queer person, so it might, have references to queer culture, as sort of like the book theme for this month, and it'll be, around every few months or whatever. But if you don't like this, let me know, because I could just read this stuff on my own time. The next book we will be reading is The Miseducation of Cameron Post, which I have already read, and I will be rereading it. I left my copy with my friend in Maryland, so I will be going to the library and supporting the library, but, I really do prefer to have my own copies of books because I like to write in them. By that I mostly mean I like to underline the lines that I like, so I did a lot of that in this book. So, The Miseducation of Cameron Post is about a young lesbian living in the Midwest, and that is all I will leave you with. And so if you want to read that, or if you want to engage in discussion, comment down below, or please join the Goodreads group. I just want people to join the Goodreads group. We currently have 4 people, 3 of which are not myself. That has been it. This has been, a little bit longer of a review than I would like to do. But it is what it is, and at least know it's done, so I can edit it and make sure it's ready on time. Please keep reading. Feel free to let me know what you thought of this book. If you want to read it, or if you were inspired to read it, or if you hated it, or whatever. I just feel like it's just me all alone here in this lonely channel, and I could use some friends. Thank you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.